The early 1930s brought an increase in the types of cantilever monoplanes, mostly of all-metal construction. At first, like most improvements, innovations arrived in passenger aviation, as the military remained conservative and the situation there was far from clear. Although prototypes of the passenger Boeing Model 247 and Douglas DC-1 and DC-2 were preparing for flight, biplanes and monoplanes of the Fokker concept still flew on the main lines, and biplanes continued to be developed and built. While this was not surprising in Great Britain, in the United States, where modern aircraft were being created, it seemed like an anachronism. In 1932-33, one of the largest American aircraft manufacturers was mass-producing twin-engine passenger biplanes. However, these machines were the last representatives of such a category, and not only in the United States. Yet, the circumstances surrounding the creation of such an aircraft were quite specific. In that situation, there was no possibility to develop anything else. Certainly, we should not blame the management of Curtiss-Wright for ignoring promising directions in aviation development. Unfortunately, in 1930, during the crisis in St. Louis, Missouri, the Curtiss-Wright plant was closed. In 1932, the management decided to urgently return it to operation and set a production schedule that would guarantee commercial success and regain a share of the passenger transport market. In the spring of 1932, Curtiss chief designer George A. Page, Jr. received a simple instruction from the chairman of the board, Ralph Damon. Take 2 colleagues, go to the plant in St. Louis, and urgently develop the design of a twin-engine biplane airliner. The aircraft design had to have not only a minimum cost of research and development, but also a quick return on investment. George A. Page, Jr. faced serious problems during development. There was neither time nor money for a modern all-metal construction, and especially for the corresponding preliminary research such as for the Boeing 247. Moreover, that machine would not sell in quantities that could guarantee its commercial success. However, the designer had a project in reserve for a transport passenger biplane, the T-32, where T stood for transport and 32 for 3,200 pounds of commercial payload. The T-32 project represented a maximally improved biplane with a voluminous fuselage, retractable landing gear, and other simple but significant improvements. These characteristics brought it closer to modern cantilever monoplanes and gave it a significant advantage over the outdated high-wing aircraft from Ford and Fokker. The model of the modern biplane proposed by Page had already been tested in the wind tunnel in Dayton, so it could be developed quickly and cheaply. The most powerful engines at that time, Wright Cyclones with 525 horsepower, were to be used as the power plant, but it was assumed that 700 horsepower engines would be available by the time of manufacture. Nevertheless, the designers had to start from a clean slate, and a new name was invented for the new aircraft. The machine under development used not only the work of George A. Page, Jr., but also the experience gained by Curtiss in the mid-20s during the construction of a series of 12 twin-engine B-2 Condor bomber biplanes. The B-2 bombers were equipped with 12-cylinder liquid-cooled Curtiss V-1570 Conqueror engines producing 630 horsepower, had fixed landing gear struts, and a tail unit with a biplane stabilizer and 2 fins. The first XB-2 took to the skies in 1927, tests went without problems, and serial machines began to enter service in May 1929. The small order did not satisfy the company, and already in the summer of 1929, a civilian version of the bomber, the Curtiss CO, also named Condor, took off. The passenger plane was equipped with 600 horsepower GV-1570 engines, a civilian version of the Conqueror, spinning 3-bladed metal propellers, unlike the 2-bladed ones on the B-2 bombers. The first civilian Condor was designed for the comfortable transport of 18 passengers. 6 examples were built, which were operated by TAT and Eastern Air Transport until the mid-30s. Passenger Condor COs, like the B-2 bombers, were manufactured by the Curtiss-Wright concern at the plant in Garden City, Long Island, New York. For the most part, the B-2 bomber differed from the passenger CO in fuselage and power plants, while the tail unit and landing gear remained unchanged. In April 1932, the small team of George A. Page, Jr. began work at the plant in St. Louis. Construction proceeded without serious problems, and on January 30, 1933, the T-32 prototype was tested. The plane truly turned out excellent. Regarding aerodynamics, there could be no complaints, except of course for the biplane box. The aircraft was distinguished by the application of the most modern improvements, among which was the electric drive for the main landing gear retraction system. The flight characteristics were also almost perfect. The machine, with a wingspan of 82 feet and a flight weight of 16,535 pounds, was very stable in the air and easy to control. All moving surfaces were mounted on ball bearings and, in addition, were equipped with Flettner tabs and had aerodynamic compensation. Piloting the T-32 was a real pleasure for many pilots. Designer George A. Page Jr. paid great attention to the comfort of all 15 passengers. The cabin walls were covered with sound-absorbing material, and during the flight, the noise level was comparable to the noise in a Pullman Express train car. Individual supply of warm and cold air was provided to each seat. Facilitating the work of ground personnel at the airport was also foreseen. The canvas covering of the aircraft had 125 special cutouts with zippers, ensuring easy access to all points of the structure that required maintenance. Mechanics could service the Curtiss-Wright GR1820 engines while standing on the ground. The equipment for each engine was located on a single surface behind the motor on massive rubber shock absorbers. Access to it was provided by lifting several metal skin panels. The T-32 became the first twin-engine passenger aircraft that could continue flight with a full load after the failure of one of the engines. Thanks to all these features, testing of the aircraft lasted less than 2 months. In March 1933, the T-32 received its airworthiness certificate, and just a week later, Eastern Air Transport purchased the first of 5 ordered machines. Curtiss-Wright gave the model the name Condor II, emphasizing that it was the successor to the first Condors, bombers and passenger planes of the previous generation. This airliner was offered to airlines for less than $60,000. Although the price was lower than any other passenger aircraft in the U.S., the Condor II still brought the company significant profits. The thorough business policy of Curtiss is evidenced even by such a nuance as serial numbers. The sales department claimed that clients might view numbers 1 or 2 with suspicion, believing they were buying a raw, untested machine. The idea arose to continue the numbering of previous models, but the number 13 was immediately rejected. Superstitions in the U.S. were so strong that hotels often did not even have a 13th floor. Ultimately, to calm customers, it was decided to start serial numbers with the number 21. The first orders arrived simultaneously from Eastern Air Transport and American Airlines. The latter received its first Condor II in April, and other machines were delivered at 2-week intervals. After brief crew training, both airlines put the planes on the most important routes. From the summer of 1933, American Airlines began flying the so-called Southern Route, and Eastern Air Transport Condors cruised on the New York-Miami line. Soon, both companies ordered additional batches, receiving a total of 9 aircraft each. Another 2 machines were purchased by the United States Army Air Corps, where they were used as transports under the designation YC-30. All examples manufactured in St. Louis were equipped with geared GR1820 engines producing 700 horsepower and 3-bladed Hamilton Standard propellers. In October 1933, production was temporarily halted. One of the planes in this series had a much more interesting fate than the others. This Condor took part in the second expedition of the famous polar explorer Richard E. Byrd. Back in 1926, he had crossed the North Pole on a 3-engine Fokker. After the Arctic, the Antarctic was next in line. His first expedition involved 3 planes, to which an all-metal Ford Stout was later added, on which Richard E. Byrd circumnavigated the South Pole in 1929. Immediately after returning to the States, preparations began for the second Antarctic mission. This was no longer just an adventure for the sake of planting a flag, but a serious scientific expedition to collect data in 27 disciplines. Funding was collected from donations, but due to the economic crisis, money came in extremely slowly. However, the explorer managed to obtain materials, equipment, and $150,000 in cash. The expedition numbered 4 aircraft, including even a Kellett autogyro. Byrd chose the Condor not only for its payload capacity and durability, but also for its canvas covering, which is much easier to repair in harsh conditions than metal. At first, Richard Byrd turned to the Curtiss-Wright management with a request to provide the plane for free. The financial state of the concern did not allow for such gifts, but fortunately, the explorer collected enough funds for the purchase. However, he received the engines and equipment, including control cables, as donations. This created quite a headache for the plant in St. Louis, as they had to mount varied, sometimes non-standard equipment. In addition, 4 extra tanks were installed in the plane, significantly increasing the flight range. This example was equipped with SR 1820 F2 Cyclone engines without reduction gears and Smith propellers. The landing gear was made fixed, with the possibility of quickly changing wheels to skis or Edo floats. The plane, painted in blue and yellow colors, received the name William Horlick, in honor of the businessman who helped most with financing. The test flight of the machine was performed by Chief Pilot Harold June. In October 1933, the expedition set off. In New Zealand, the Condor received new Hamilton Standard propellers, which had a pitch change mechanism in flight. Before landing in Antarctica, the plane on floats made 3 reconnaissance flights in the area of the Great Ice Barrier. And on January 18, 1934, on the first day on the mainland, it took off on skis from the Little America base. Soon, flights with a range of up to 11-20 miles became commonplace. The machine survived the winter of 1934 in a hangar built of snow. And although the 1935 expedition itself ended in failure, only 2 planes withstood the onslaught of the elements, this Condor and an American Pilgrim. Until this moment, all T-32s flew with old series Wright Cyclone engines and propellers whose pitch could only be changed on the ground. But in 1933, Hamilton Standard released its famous variable pitch propellers onto the market. This gave impetus to the modernization of the Condors. It was decided to install SGR 1820 engines with superchargers, which received longer and aerodynamically more perfect NACA cowlings. For better airflow, the engine nacelles were extended all the way to the trailing edge of the wing, and fuel capacity was increased. The modernized machines received the designation AT-32. Customers could choose one of 5 versions, which differed in engine power and cabin layout, from 12 to 15 seats sitting or sleeping. However, already in the second half of 1933, the Curtiss-Wright management realized, despite all improvements, selling the AT-32 would be difficult. Although the Condor had almost caught up with the Boeing 247, it was losing hopelessly to the newest DC-2. Then the concern decided to play on a different field, since military biplane bombers of that time had rather mediocre characteristics. The idea arose to create a bomber version of the Condor that could easily be converted back into a transport. The calculation was simple. Such universal machines could interest the air forces of small nations. Thus, work on a new modification began at Curtiss. The idea of using the T-32 as a convenient intermediate type, which the military could use at low cost until the appearance of modern all-metal monoplane bombers, led to the creation of the modified Condor. Curtiss began building an adapted version with a more convex lower fuselage, which allowed bomb racks to be placed under the cabin floor. They decided not to make bomb bay doors. Another 14 119-pound bombs could be suspended under the lower wing, bringing the total bomb load to 4,000 pounds. 2 glazed turrets were installed on top of the fuselage, each with Browning machine guns. 4 additional tanks inside the fuselage increased the fuel reserve to 750 gallons. For demonstrations, the Curtiss-Wright concern built a prototype at its own expense, designated BT-32. The machine made its first flight on February 9, 1934, even before the first flight of the passenger AT-32, and flew very successfully. The company offered the plane to the United States Army Air Corps, USAAC, but the machine did not interest the American military. However, in 1934, they managed to sell 7 BT-32 bombers. The first of them, the Demonstration 1, was sent to China. The machine was supposed to serve as a bomber, but ultimately became the personal plane of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. In June, 4 planes were purchased by Colombia, and later 2 BT-32s were bought by Bolivia. All these machines were equipped with variable pitch propellers of Curtiss-Wright's own design, developed in cooperation with the U.S. Navy. In the case of the passenger AT-32, the first of which took to the air in mid-February 1934, changes in design allowed for a significant improvement in flight characteristics. Maximum speed increased by 20 miles per hour, and flight range increased by 1.5 times. The largest buyer of the new Condors became American Airlines, which ordered 10 machines. In addition, old T-32s were brought up to the AT-32 standard, assigning them the designation T-32C. Eastern Air Transport was more cautious. Its management believed that the time of new biplanes had passed and satisfied itself only with installing new variable pitch propellers, leaving the rest of the structure unchanged. The second manufactured T-32 was purchased by the Swiss airline Swissair. The plane was delivered to buyers in January 1934, and it attracted great attention when Swissair introduced it on the Zurich-Berlin line. It was the first airliner on European routes to have a stewardess on board, an American innovation that was not yet known in Europe. Unfortunately, the Condor's service in Switzerland was short-lived. 3 months later, the plane's wing broke in flight due to a material defect. In this crash, which turned out to be the only one in the entire history of Condor operations, the crew and all passengers died. The U.S. Navy purchased 2 T-32 machines in a version with separate seats. They were assigned the designation R4C1. These planes were equipped with Curtiss-Wright propellers with electric pitch change drive, unlike the hydraulic ones in Hamilton propellers. In November 1935, the naval Condors were transferred to a U.S. Marine Corps squadron. The third main modification, T-32, was probably the first aircraft in the world specially created for cargo transport. The Curtiss-Wright T32 had a large cargo door on the starboard side, above which a removable swiveling winch was mounted. Another notable difference was round portholes instead of rectangular ones. The floor was reinforced and equipped with loops for cargo lashing. Using a ramp and winch, even a passenger car could be loaded into the plane, which was a landmark event for those times. But it seems the time for such a novelty had not yet come. The company was able to sell only 3 examples to the Argentine Naval Aviation, which in the end never used their special capabilities. Machines of this type could transport 24 fully equipped soldiers, 10 wounded on stretchers, or almost 4,190 pounds of cargo. In the summer of 1934, when Curtiss was shipping Condors on average 1 per week, these machines worked on all main lines of American Airlines and Eastern Air Transport. Production was erratic. Sometimes 2 machines were rolled out of the shop in a couple of days, which made the release schedule and serial numbers create a rather confusing picture. But the dominance of these planes on passenger lines turned out to be much shorter than that of competitors. Already in January, the American Airlines fleet was replenished with the first Douglas DC-2. All the airline's advertising attention instantly switched to the novelty, which offered the perfect combination of speed and comfort. Soon, DC-2s captured all major routes. The new, but already morally obsolete, Condors were transferred to night flights, converting the cabin for sleeping berths. The calculation was that at night, the lower cruising speed would not play a big role. However, even the ability to sleep in flight could not divert passenger attention from faster planes. At the end of 1935, it became clear that the days of the Condors were numbered, and in 1936, the newest Douglas DC-3s, in the development of which American Airlines had invested its own funds, joined the fleet. Eastern Air Transport abandoned operation even faster. Their routes along the Atlantic coast were quite short, so conversion to a sleeper version did not justify itself. Instead of biplanes, they ordered DC-2s and even faster Lockheed 14 Super Electras. By the end of the year, both airlines had sold all airworthy machines abroad, so by the beginning of 1937, not a single civilian aircraft of this type remained in the U.S. Most machines were bought by small carriers from Central and South America. 4 planes were purchased by the newly created British company International Air Freight, which planned to engage exclusively in cargo transportation. In the summer of 1937, the company opened express lines from London to Brussels and Amsterdam. However, International Air Freight only repeated the sad experience of the cargo version of the T-32. The public and business did not yet understand the advantages of cargo aviation. Interest was meager, and in 1938 the company was liquidated. Although its Condors formally passed to the jurisdiction of the Air Ministry, they never took to the air again and gradually rotted in the backyards of London's Croydon Aerodrome. Meanwhile, the military versions YC-30 and R4C1 continued to serve reliably in the Army and U.S. Marine Corps, undergoing minor upgrades. After the successful experience of the previous polar mission, it is not surprising that for the new expedition, which for the first time had state support, the Marine Corps provided both of its R4C1s. Before the transfer, the planes were painted bright red for better visibility on snow, and the black inscription U.S. Antarctic Service was applied to the sides. The expedition set off in 1939, and the Condors again showed themselves well. Unfortunately, their finale was tragic. In January 1941, one of them made a forced landing and was abandoned to its fate amidst the ice, and the second was washed into the sea by a storm that same year. 6 planes that originally belonged to American Airlines were purchased in 1939 by the Chinese transport airline China National Aviation Corporation. The machines were based in Hong Kong and were used mainly for transporting cargo. In December 1941, 5 of them were destroyed during a raid by Japanese bombers. The only surviving plane was confiscated by the Japanese and, applying camouflage and their own insignia, used as a military transport. Some machines were operated for surprisingly long, even for such a reliable type. One Condor that previously flew for American Airlines worked in Alaska, and in 1944 it was bought by Mexico, where it served until 1950. Another 3 former American Airlines machines were purchased by the Chilean airline LAN, and 2 Eastern Air Transport boards were sold to the Colombian SACO. Subsequently, the Colombian planes were bought by the Salvadoran company TACA, which later added another Condor from LAN airline to its fleet. After World War II, Sigun Salvadoran machines were sold to Mexico. The record for duration of operation belongs to one of the last manufactured T-32s. At first, the plane belonged to the airline Peruana de Aviación, and in 1941 it was requisitioned by the Peruvian Air Force, where it served until 1956. Of the 45 Condors of all modifications, not a single one has survived to our time. The R-4C-1 plane from the Byrd expedition can hardly be counted, although it has quite likely been well preserved in the ice of Antarctica. The chances of finding it are meager. However, enthusiasts and museums continue to search for the remains of historical machines everywhere. Perhaps someone will be found who will not leave the Condor under the snow to wait for archaeologists of the future. Structurally, the Curtiss T-32 Condor was a twin-engine biplane with an all-metal frame. In the standard version, it was equipped with retractable landing gear and a tailwheel. At the base of the wings, with a NACA 4212 profile, lay a 2-spar construction made of aluminum alloy. The covering was mostly canvas, and only the leading edge, the so-called nose of the wing, was covered with duralumin. The upper wing received a straight center section of significant span, which was attached above the fuselage on struts and connected to the engine nacelles by braces. It was here in the center section that engineers placed 4 main fuel tanks. Engine nacelles were installed on the lower wing. The consoles of both wings had the same dihedral angle and were connected to each other by a pair of simple struts. Ailerons occupied almost the entire span of the consoles, but were located only on the upper wing. They had a metal leading edge, were covered with canvas, and were equipped with balancing tabs that were adjusted on the ground. Interestingly, the design of the T-32 did not foresee flaps. The fuselage was formed by a welded truss of chrome molybdenum steel tubes. A light duralumin frame gave it a streamlined look, over which a canvas covering was stretched. Only the nose cone and tail section were covered with metal. An important detail for comfort, the space between the outer skin and the cabin walls was tightly filled with sound-absorbing material. In the fully enclosed cockpit, pilots were seated side by side. All controls, except for pedals, were brought to a central console, and a workspace for a radio operator was arranged behind the commander's seat. The passenger cabin was designed for 15 seats, 5 rows of 3 seats, where on one side they were paired. An interesting fact, this was the first aircraft in the world where each passenger seat was equipped with an individual warm and cold airflow system. The entrance door was located on the starboard side. Immediately behind the cabin was a lavatory, and a compartment for luggage and mail, which held almost 660 pounds of cargo, was hidden under the floor of the passenger cabin. The tail unit, like the wing, had a metal frame with canvas covering, except for the leading edges covered with duralumin. Elevators and rudders were equipped with trim tabs. Regarding the power plant, the T-32 was fitted with 2 Wright GR1820 Cyclone engines, and later modifications, with the SGR1820 version with a supercharger. All modifications of the Wright Cyclone are 9-cylinder radial air-cooled motors. On the first models, they were covered with Town & Rings, and later full NACA cowlings began to be used. Most planes had three-bladed metal Hamilton standard propellers with hydraulic pitch change. At first, the pitch could only be changed on the ground, but starting with the T-32 modification, propellers controllable in flight began to be installed. Subsequently, they were also installed on earlier machines. Some boards were equipped with Curtiss-Wright propellers with electric drive. The landing gear of standard machines was wheeled, retractable in flight, with a track of over 20 feet. The main struts of the pyramidal type were hidden back into the engine nacelles using an electric drive. A thoughtful detail: in the retracted position, part of the wheel protruded outward, protecting the airframe during a possible belly landing. The tail wheel did not retract. All struts had hydraulic shock absorbers. 3 Condors working in Antarctica flew on fixed ski landing gear. For example, on Bird's first plane, the skis were wooden, 16 feet long. Instead of a tail wheel, a small ski was also installed. In addition, Edo float landing gear could be installed on this machine. Each metal float had a volume of almost 1,050 gallons. Thank you for being with us and learning more about the history of this unique aircraft. If you liked the video, support the channel and see you in the next episodes.